Hi, welcome to the lecture for Chapter 6, Freedom or Free Will versus Determinism. Free will and determinism go to the heart of many philosophical, sociological, psychological, economic, and cultural theories and worldviews, and these concepts are certainly central to any conception of morality. Free will is what appears to separate us from nature and from other animals. And yet much recent science tells us that we may not actually have free will. The author in this book clearly opts for a particular view, and he does this in other chapters as well, but you will need to make decisions as good critical thinkers about whether to run with the author's idea of free will versus determinism, or if you have a different idea. But this author does do a pretty good job of explaining the general concepts and how they fit together, and then how they fit in with morality more generally. Determinism means universal causation. So for everything that occurs, there is a corresponding cause. Now, determinism by itself does not necessarily mean that free will does not exist. There is at least one camp or group that thinks that determinism and free will are compatible. But initially, we're going to take determinism by itself and the various theories of determinism, and then later on in this lecture, see whether determinism can actually fit together with free will. But if determinism is true, one question we have is how can people be responsible for their actions? The idea here is that if for everything that occurs there is a corresponding cause, then why should I be held responsible for the consequences of my actions, or maybe even for my actions generally, if there was some cause external to me that brought about the action or the consequence. There are different theories of determinism, and we're going to look at a number of them. But briefly, just as kind of a roadmap for us, there's a religious, physical, or natural sciences, history, economic, and psychological theory of determinism. And all of these help to form arguments and theories that support the idea of determinism, that there are causes out there for every action or consequence. So to begin with, we'll take religious determinism, which derives its attributes from God. So if you don't believe in God, or you believe in a particular God, let's just set those beliefs aside for a moment so that we can kind of at least understand the religious determinism argument here. The God that a religious determinism requires is an all-knowing, all-powerful being. So whatever that looks like to you, so long as it's all-knowing and all-powerful, that's what's required for this religious determinism theory to get off the ground. And so this God determines the course of events. Of course, this raises a number of issues, one of which is the issue of proof, because a supernatural being is really hard to prove. And the other issue is the problem of evil. So if there's kind of an all-knowing, all-powerful God out there, why does evil exist in the world? And lastly, this idea raises a problem of salvation. So if there's an all-knowing, all-powerful God and things are determined, then how can we ever kind of be forgiven or change our ways? The next theory we'll talk about is scientific determinism. And science is founded on universal causation, principles of physics, laws of nature, that kind of thing. And such causation means that there is no freedom. So I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just giving you kind of the tagline of the scientific determinism theory. So science is founded on universal causation, and what it means for that causation to exist is that free will does not exist. So some of this is founded on Newton's law and the idea that everything is caused by physical laws, which results in freedom being an illusion. Some problems with that theory or that idea is that human beings do and can transcend physical laws. And then we have the discovery of modern physics, which raises doubts about Newton's own views. Another type of scientific determinism is this biological and genetic determinism. Here, this is founded more on the theory of natural selection, which of course is not connected to freedom. The idea there is that nature governs the process of selection, and the modern theory here is that genetic makeup is what governs the process of selection and kind of and determines the causes for our actions and consequences. Another problem with this particular type of scientific determinism is that the theory ignores both mental and spiritual side of what it means to be a human being. We also have historical or cultural determinism, and the idea here was created by George W.F. Hegel, and he believed in an absolute mind that manifests itself throughout various periods of world history with the goal of achieving a state of perfection. And so he gets away from both the God, the absolute, all-knowing, all-powerful being, and gets away from science, and instead fills that kind of foundation with this idea of an absolute mind. And he looks to history and world history to see examples of this. Some problems with Hegel's theory, again, are that it's difficult to prove the existence of some absolute mind. It's also tricky to figure out kind of what he means by an absolute mind. Does he mean some type of God but divorced of a particular religion? Does that mean a supernatural being, or what else did Hegel really have in mind there? Again, there's kind of lack of proof or lack of support for whatever an absolute mind might mean. And then we also have examples from human development that are not totally determined by history or culture. And so we have essentially counterexamples to Hegel's theory. Next, we have economic or social determinism. And one proponent of this theory was Karl Marx. And his theory was based on the argument that our characters and actions are economically and socially determined. So his idea is that human characters and actions are determined by economics and our social situations. He also thinks that natural forces will end up leading to a classless society, so that nature, economics, and our kind of social situations and social makeup will eventually kind of cause classes to kind of dissolve. Some problems with his theory are that they're based on some unproved assumptions. It's unclear that our characters are shaped so dramatically by economics and society, and it's also unclear that there is any kind of natural force or that we're moving to a classless society. If we look back in history, not just in our nation, but in a number of nations, classes and the class kind of system and separations don't actually seem to be dissipating. So that's one problem for Marx's theory. Another is the idea or the example that we see from science and technology and the influence that science and technology have on our characters and on our moral characters, because it does seem that science and technology are influencing us, and so that kind of shows that there's something outside of this economic or social influence that Marx focused on. Next, we'll look at psychological determinism, and there are kind of two breakdowns of psychological determinism. There's this Freudianism and then behaviorism. So first we'll take Freudianism. Sigmund Freud's theory, essentially, it's a deterministic theory, of course, we're still in determinism, but he argues that humans are determined by their unconscious minds, and that by natural drives that are repressed by society's mores and customs, that shapes how we are developed. Freud thought that humans are determined, so our human characters, our moral characters, are determined prior to birth, so while we're still in the womb. The example he or some psychological determinists focus on is the fable of the Oedipus complex, or the fable of Oedipus, that's referenced in the book. This theory is sometimes used to defend or justify criminal actions, because the idea is, if we are predetermined, if our characters are determined before we are even born, then clearly if I commit some heinous act, I'm not responsible for it, because my character was formed before I even kind of existed in the outside world, outside of my mother's womb. So how in the world can I be responsible for those actions when they were determined prior to my birth? So that is actually one criticism of Freud's theory. Another is that it's too general, and a third is that there's little evidence to support this idea that we are determined so far in advance. Behaviorism, which again is that second type of psychological determinism, is kind of offered up by B.F. Skinner, and his theory is a little bit more complex than Freud's. And he essentially claims that human beings are physical beings, and that our behavior is the result of conditioning from our environment. So he again will say that free will or freedom is an illusion. One problem with his theory is he essentially boils us down to these physical beings. And so he says, look, we are physical beings, we're physical material. Essentially, we're lacking a mind or a soul or an ego or an essence or whatever else makes up people. So he denies the existence of freedom, and he applies this conditioning to everyone, which can be problematic because we see a lot of variety in our moral characters between individuals and between groups and nations, but he says that this environment kind of conditions all of us. So we are moving away from the determinism kind of theories and camp, and now we're going to talk about fatalism and indeterminism. Fatalism is not the same as determinism. Remember a few moments ago I said that determinism is the idea that for everything out there, there is a cause. Fatalism is the idea that all events are permanently fixed and 100% predetermined. Fatalism and determinism are different. Remember I said that with determinism, some determinist theories actually believe that determinism is compatible with free will. Fatalism says that there is no way that determinism is compatible with free will. So with fatalism, all events are irrevocably fixed and beyond all human control. So if you are fated to do something, it doesn't matter how hard you try not to do that thing, you're going to do it. Why? Because it's been predetermined, 100% out of your control. So that's more extreme and different than simply saying that everything has a cause. So I just want to make sure that we're really clear that fatalism is not the same as determinism. That's an area where students kind of get confused sometimes because they're similar, but they're not the same idea. Some traits of a true fatalist. A true fatalist is never going to worry about stopping the stop sign. They're not going to take medications to lower blood pressure or try to put cancer in remission. They're not going to protect themselves. And a true fatalist would never, ever think of studying for an ethics exam. Why? Because how you're going to do on that exam is already predetermined. It doesn't matter how much you study, you're going to pass or fail based on this predetermined kind of path of your life. And so fatalism is a hard bullet to bite. I don't think we're going to have many fatalists in the class, but if you're a true fatalist, then you should stop listening to this lecture and stop reading the book and don't study for the exam, because all of that is futile. Everything's already determined. Hard determinism is the idea that everything is caused, and so there is no free will. Hard determinism is also different than fatalism insofar as a hard determinist is going to say that humans actually can change the future, but this will be as a result of their own personal makeup or environment and not a result of free choice. So a hard determinist, it would sometimes be called an incompatibilist because they think that free will and determinism are incompatible. Certain causes are beyond human control for the hard determinist, but they do not maintain that humans can affect nothing at all. So again, hard determinism is not the same as fatalism. The hard determinists' kind of argument or idea basically is that humans act in accordance with our choices and that we choose in accordance with our desires, but that those desires are not free. We are not free to kind of decide what it is we desire. Soft determinism is sometimes called compatibilism. So if you see that term out there or you hear that, those two names are sometimes interchanged. But the idea behind soft determinism is that everything is caused, but some events are caused by humans by means of their own minds or wills, and then some events are caused outside of us. So thus, one is neither completely free nor completely determined. Freedom is strictly limited because human beings originate some of the causes, and then there are external factors causing other attributes or actions or consequences about us or surrounding us. So the idea behind soft determinism, again, is that it's compatibilist. It says, yeah, we have free will over some things, and then other things are determined, right? There's some cause external to us. One criticism of this theory, actually two criticisms. You get criticisms from the hard determinists who say absolutely not, free will cannot be compatible with determinism, and we are determined, so there is no free will. And then we also see criticisms from the indeterminists. One kind of general criticism or problem you'll have to face if you decide that you are a soft determinist is to figure out how many and which causes originate from us and which causes are originating outside of us. So basically, what is it that we have control over, and what are the things that we don't have control over, and how do we know that? And then moving forward, thinking about kind of moving on to the chapters later in this book, what does that mean for responsibility, right? How can we hold someone responsible if they're the cause in some ways of their actions, but not the cause in other ways of their actions? So don't kind of answer that. You don't have to come up with an answer for how we decide responsibility right now, but that's something to kind of keep in the back of your mind because it will be an issue moving forward. So I just mentioned indeterminism, but we haven't actually talked about it yet. So the idea here is that there is freedom and there's also chance in the world. So it's kind of the idea that we are free in some ways, and then the rest of it is almost left up to luck. And we see freedom, especially when we look at human deliberation, and in particular, moral deliberation. That seems to be an area where we do have some amount of freedom. William James was a major proponent of this view. One kind of problem or thing to look out for with this view is that if acts are uncaused or indeterminate, then nobody could be said to be responsible for them. So if we have forces or actions rather that are uncaused, then we really don't know how to make sense of that. So for a determinist, if we have an action that's caused, we know what to do with that, right? We look at whether the human was the cause or something external to the human was the cause, and then we work to figure out how we should attribute moral responsibility. But in the indeterminist view, we have humans being the cause sometimes, and then we have like nothing being the cause the other time, this kind of uncaused action. And that's really tricky to figure out how to attribute moral responsibility in those cases, because there's either no cause or we don't know what the cause is. And so that kind of messes up our calculus, essentially, when we are trying to figure out whether to hold someone morally accountable. And so we have accidents or chance, and some amount of human freedom. With this view, however, it's unclear what that freedom really amounts to. Is it a freedom? Am I free if I'm like not kind of in handcuffs, or do I need something else to be free? So there are some major criticisms of the hard determinism position. And again, that's the position that determinism is true and it's incompatible with free will. The biggest criticism is going to come from people who think that there is free will. We do have freedom as moral beings. So for hard determinists, morality is an illusion. You can't hold anybody responsible. Why not? Because they're not responsible. We didn't cause any of our actions. They're all caused outside of us, and we don't have free will. And it seems unjust to hold someone morally responsible if they're not morally free. Hospers is a person who brings some criticism against the hard determinist position, and says, look, we can actually free ourselves of certain desires. We see people all the time who quit alcohol or quit smoking, and so it does seem that we are free to make these changes in our lives. And so that's a way to use kind of empirical evidence and real examples from the real world to show that it does really feel like we have free will. Another complaint against the hard determinist is that they've pushed the meaning of freedom to mean completely free, or to be kind of causes in and of ourselves, so that if anything about ourselves or our actions is determined at all, then it must mean that we're not free. And Hosper says, look, that's really using language inaccurately. Because we're never going to be free of our biological or genetic makeup. And so I wasn't free to choose whether I was born genetically and biologically female as opposed to male. But the fact that I lacked that choice doesn't undermine my free will or freedom in the world. The fact that I didn't get to make that choice doesn't mean that I can't freely make other choices. He also says, look, how could we possibly develop ourselves without any influence from anything outside of ourselves, right? Any genetic or biological kind of makeup, any nature, the fact that I was raised by the parents I was raised by, the fact that I was born in California, in kind of a modern era, as opposed to 1850 or something. Of course, all of those influences will factor into, and in some sense cause, who I am and how I behave, because I can't be free of those causes. If I'm free of those causes, then who is the me? Who is the I that's free of those causes? I don't have, none of us start with a blank slate, essentially, is the idea there. Then we also look at the issue of human complexity, and the hard determinist position really ignores the complexity of human beings and reduces consciousness, for example, to a physical phenomenon. It reduces everything to this lowest common denominator, which is our physical beings, right? This kind of skin and bones and tissue, and that's it. And it does seem like human beings are much more complex than just a series of bones connected with tissue and kind of wrapped up in skin. The belief of psychological egoists essentially is that human actions are performed by humans strictly for self-interest, and of course that ignores altruistic motives. And one way to refute a psychological egoist claim is to prove that actions are performed for someone else's interests. And that's a way to show that humans actually do have control over causation. I am free to act in a way that is purely altruistic and not simply in my self-interest. So in looking at determinism and free will, we also need to look at kind of levels of differences between different kinds of things in the world. And there are a number of types of differences, but in particular, we're focused on freedom. And so we can consider rocks and plants, and then animals and humans, and it seems to be kind of in a spectrum there. And freedom or choice seems to increase the farther you go up on the evolutionary scale. So it seems like rocks have very little or no free will. Plants, probably not, but there are some types of plants that do seem to kind of respond to external stimuli. And then we have animals. And if you've had any experience with animals, it doesn't seem like they're being kind of controlled or in a predetermined path. Animals do make choices. My dog has a preference for some dog toys over other dog toys, or he prefers some people to, people in his family to strangers he sees on the street. And so it does seem that he's making choices in a sense, maybe not at the same level that you and I are making choices, but he certainly is not kind of moving through the world without any opinions at all. And then we get human beings, and humans have sophisticated consciousness and minds and emotions. And so it seems like human beings have an increased freedom. Jean-Paul Sartre was a proponent of existentialism, and he essentially argued that humans are confronted by freedom in that consciousness intends and creates this experience. We make choices in related situations that may be determined. So, for example, from Sartre's perspective, we choose how to live in relation to those things that may be determined for us. So the idea there is that I was born, for an example, I was born genetically and biologically female, and I didn't get to choose that, but now that I'm here, I get to make choices in relation to the fact that I was born genetically and biologically female. And so his idea is that human perception is open-ended and that we are not completely determined with regard to how we live our lives. Sure, some things are determined and totally out of our control, but then once those things are kind of established, we again have the ability to make choices kind of within that framework, if you will. So just as a summary here, soft determinism, according to our author, appears to be the best alternative. Remember that soft determinism is also called compatibilism by some folks out there. And so our author says, look, I've decided for himself that this is kind of the most viable option. You do not have to subscribe to that theory, and I am not expecting you to. So on a writing assignment or on an exam, I'm not expecting you to believe or support the soft determinism theory. But that's the one that our author chose. And the idea is that freedom is limited by external factors of all sorts, but we are free to choose and to not choose how we respond to them, to act or not act in relation to those factors. And so thus it makes sense to assign moral responsibility to human beings because we are making some choices. And so it's rational to praise and blame and reward and punish people. All right, that's it for chapter 6.